A Tyrannosaurus rex skeleton just sold for $31.8 million. It was the most expensive animal ever sold, and it has been dead for 67 million years. On the evening of the 6th of October, 2020, inside Christie's auction house in New York, that Tyrannosaurus rex skeleton, nicknamed Stan, officially designated BHI 3033, went under the hammer. $31.8 million. Not a painting, not a sculpture, but a pile of fossilized bone dug out of a South Dakota hillside that sold for more than most Picassos will ever fetch. And here's the part that should bother you if you've ever put money into the stock market. Stan wasn't a fluke. He was a signal. Over the last 3 decades, the price of a world-class dinosaur skeleton has climbed a curve that looks less like a museum acquisition and more like a hot tech stock. Early, volatile, and absurdly steep. We're watching the birth of a genuine alternative asset class, and it's made of bone. So the question this video is really about isn't how much a dinosaur is worth, it's something stranger. Why is a dead animal behaving like a financial asset? And what do the rest of us lose when it does? To understand the number, you first have to understand the scarcity. In the entire history of paleontology, more than a century of digging across every continent, fewer than 50 reasonably complete Tyrannosaurus rex skeletons have ever been found. Fewer than 50. And of those, only around a dozen are complete enough that a scientist would call them a real articulated specimen, rather than a scatter of fragments. To put that in perspective, there are more billionaires on Earth than there are good T-Rex skeletons. One of those things is genuinely rarer than the other. Stan was one of the good ones. 188 bones, and a skull so intact it became one of the most studied tyrannosaur heads in all of science. He stretched 40 feet long, stood 13 feet tall at the hip, and weighed somewhere between 7 and 8 tons when he was alive and breathing and hunting in the late Cretaceous, the Maastrichtian Age, around 67 million years ago, in what is now the Hell Creek Formation of South Dakota. He was discovered in 1987 by an amateur fossil hunter named Stan Sacrison, who spotted bone fragments weathering out of the South Dakota Badlands, and the skeleton was named after him. 5 years later, the Black Hills Institute excavated the rest, and for 2 decades, Stan stood in their building as a research specimen, with casts of his bones shipped out to museums from Tokyo to New Mexico. So how does a research specimen become a $31 million object? You need a precedent, and the precedent has a name too, Sue. In 1997, the most complete T-Rex ever found, a specimen cataloged as FMNHPR 2081, known to the world simply as Sue, sold at auction for $8.36 million. At the time, that was a shocking, almost scandalous number for a fossil. It set the fossil auction record. The Field Museum in Chicago could only win her with corporate help, with Disney and McDonald's chipping in to fund the purchase. Adjust that price for inflation, and Sue cost the equivalent of around $13.5 million in today's money. Now hold those two numbers next to each other. Sue, the gold standard, around $13.5 million in modern terms, and then Stan, BHI 3033, a very good skeleton, but not even the best one, selling for $31.8 million in 2020. The fossil auction record had more than doubled its all-time benchmark, and it had done it to a specimen that wasn't even the record holder for completeness. It gets sharper. Christie's, the auction house, are not naive about value. Their pre-sale estimate for Stan was $6 to $8 million. The room quadrupled it. In about 20 minutes of telephone bidding, a handful of anonymous buyers pushed the price 4 times past what the experts believed it was worth. And here's the detail that should make any investor sit up. That same Christie sale, the 20th century evening sale, also featured a painting by the American artist Cy Twombly, a verified blue-chip name on the modern art market, and the Twombly sold for around $38.7 million. Stan, a literal monster pulled out of the ground, finished the night in the same financial weight class as blue-chip modern art. Here's why the market behaves like this. A fossil sits at the exact intersection of 3 things wealth has always chased. It's provably physically rare, because nobody is making more Cretaceous predators. At the very top end, it's almost impossible to fake convincingly, because real articulated bone carries a forensic signature. And it's, without much competition, the single most charismatic object a human being can place in a room. A painting is the record of a genius having an idea. A Tyrannosaurus rex is 67 million years of deep time, standing on a steel armature, looking down at you. You cannot commission another one. And scarcity that absolute doesn't behave like a collectible, it behaves like an asset. This is the point where Stan's story stops being an auction report and turns into a detective story. When the hammer came down that night, the buyer was anonymous. The winning bid was placed by phone, through a Christie specialist in London, on behalf of a client whose name was never released. And then something genuinely unsettling happened. Stan vanished. For 2 full years, almost nobody outside a very small circle knew where the most expensive fossil on the planet had gone. For paleontologists, that silence was the nightmare scenario, because once a specimen leaves the public world, a private owner can do almost anything with it. They can lock it in a vault. They can ship it somewhere with no scientific access. In the worst case, they can sell it off piece by piece. A skull to one collector, a claw to another, and a 67-million-year-old skeleton stops existing as a skeleton at all. A specimen that disappears is, for science, a specimen that has effectively died a second time. The rumors filled the vacuum. At one point, the actor Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson appeared on a football broadcast with a Tyrannosaur skull mounted behind him, and a corner of the internet instantly decided that he was Stan's mystery buyer. He wasn't. The skull was a cast, a high-quality replica of exactly the kind that had been sold for decades, and the real Stan was still missing. The answer, when it finally came, didn't come from a tip or a leak. It came from a reporter at National Geographic named Michael Greshko, who did something quietly brilliant. He didn't chase the rumor, he chased the paperwork. Greshko knew something specific. He knew roughly what Stan weighed, crated for transport, around 5.5 tons. So instead of asking who bought the dinosaur, he went through United States trade and export records, looking for the dinosaur itself moving across a border. And he found it. A single shipment, 5.6 tons, leaving New York, bound for the United Arab Emirates in May of 2021. Its declared value, recorded in the customs data, was $31,847,500, Stan's exact hammer price to the dollar. In March of 2022, Abu Dhabi confirmed it. The emirate had bought Stan. He was destined for a brand new institution, the Natural History Museum Abu Dhabi, rising on Saadiyat Island, in the same cultural district as the Louvre Abu Dhabi. A government had bought the king of dinosaurs. And in November of 2025, that museum finally opened its doors, the Natural History Museum Abu Dhabi, welcoming the public for the first time. And Stan is the centerpiece. But the museum didn't simply stand him in a hall. They posed him mid-fight, locked in combat against a second Tyrannosaur, the two of them clashing over the body of a fallen Triceratops. It's the first time any museum on Earth has mounted 2 T-Rexes fighting, and there's a real scientific reason it works. Stan's own neck vertebrae carry healed bite marks, injuries that knitted back together while he was still alive. Before he died, the real Stan fought another giant predator and survived it long enough to heal. So the most expensive animal ever sold didn't vanish into a vault after all. He ended up on a pedestal under museum lights, watched by the public. A happy ending. Hold on to that thought, because the ending is exactly where the problem starts. For every Stan, there's a question the scientific community has been raising its voice about for years. In the weeks before the Stan auction, the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology, the main professional body for the entire field, wrote to Christie's directly. They asked the auction house to restrict the bidding to public institutions, to buyers who would commit to keeping the specimen accessible to research, in the public trust forever. Christie's ran an open auction anyway. And that isn't a villain story, because an auction house exists to get the highest price. It's a structural story, because the moment the bidding is open, the math changes for everyone else in the building. When a Tyrannosaurus rex sells for $31.8 million and a stegosaurus sells for $44.6 million, you have quietly priced almost every museum on Earth out of the room. Museum acquisition budgets don't have a spare $40 million sitting in them. They never have. So the great fossils stop competing against other museums and they start competing against finance, against private wealth, against sovereign wealth, against the simple desire of very rich people to own the most impressive object in any conversation. Look at who actually won. Stan went to Abu Dhabi, to a government. Apex, the record-breaking stegosaurus, whose bones come from the Morrison Formation of Colorado, was bought by Ken Griffin, the founder of the hedge fund Citadel, and one of the wealthiest men in America. Two of the most scientifically important fossils of the century, owned now by a Gulf state and a hedge fund billionaire. And to be fair, genuinely fair, both of those stories ended well for the public. Stan is on display in Abu Dhabi. Griffin loaned Apex to the American Museum of Natural History in New York for a 4-year public exhibition, a loan running through at least 2028, and let scientists take samples for study. That's a good outcome, but notice what it depends on. It depends entirely on the goodwill of the owner. A loan can be revoked, a government can change its mind, and the next record-breaking buyer might have no interest in museums at all, with nothing to compel them to share. There's a darker edge too. When prices go vertical, fraud follows the money. In 2022, Christie's had to pull a Tyrannosaurus rex from an auction in Hong Kong at the last minute, over doubts about how much of the specimen was genuinely real. And every record-breaking headline sends the same signal back out to the Badlands of South Dakota and Colorado and Wyoming. There is now life-changing money sitting in the ground. That accelerates digging, and not all of that digging is careful. Not all of it is documented, and not all of it is legal. Fossil preparation takes years of skilled work, precisely because the context matters as much as the bone. The rock layer, the surrounding matrix, the associated material. Rip it out fast with no record of any of that, and you've destroyed most of the scientific information it was carrying. So the market doesn't just raise the price, it can quietly destroy the very thing it claims to value. So, is a dinosaur actually a good investment? On the raw numbers, this alternative asset class has been astonishing. $8.36 million to $31.8 to $44.6 in under 30 years. Very few asset classes can show a chart like that. But be honest about what that market truly is. It's thin because only a handful of trophy specimens trade in an entire decade. It's wildly illiquid because you can't sell a Tyrannosaurus rex on a Tuesday afternoon the way you sell a share. And every single dollar of that price is paid partly in a currency that never shows up on a balance sheet: scientific access. A fossil isn't really a luxury object. It's a 67-million-year-old dataset. Stan's bones recorded a broken neck, a hard life, a fight survived, and they carry information about growth, about disease, about how the largest land predator that ever lived actually lived. When that skeleton becomes a private asset, the data doesn't vanish, but the right to read it now belongs to whoever holds the receipt. When Stan sold for $31.8 million, what changed hands was never really a pile of bone. It was a piece of the planet's own memory and the power to decide who's allowed to study it. That's the true price of the most expensive animal on Earth. It was never $31.8 million. The real price is the question underneath it. When deep time becomes an asset class, who owns the past?